I'm Marnie, and today I'm going to talk about the Reform Act of 1832. And the Reform Act of 1832 took place in the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom had and still has an English Parliament. And an English Parliament is made up of two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And the House of Lords members were hereditary nobility and church leaders, and the House of Commons were elected officials. Keep in mind that as a whole there's very limited suffrage, and that meant that there were very few members in the House of Commons. To be able to vote, and there was property requirements, and to be able to hold in place in office, there were even higher property requirements. So the House of Commons, because of this, House of Commons was dominated by landowners. And it's actually known that the House of Commons could buy the House of Lords 4 times. They were just extremely wealthy. And at the time, there was what we call congressional districts. And the congressional districts were a unit of representation. However, the congressional districts have not been updated since the Industrial Revolution. They were created before the Industrial Revolution, and before the Industrial Revolution, many people lived in the rural areas. But the Industrial Revolution happened, and many people moved to the city. But the congressional districts were not updated. So what formed is what we call rotten boroughs. And rotten boroughs is when there was data that was very old data. And basically, it was saying that a lot of people live in the rural area, so they deserve blank amount of representatives. Not a lot of people live in the cities, they deserve blank amount of representatives. But this was very inaccurate because of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people moved to the city, but they didn't update it. So there were very few people living in the rural areas, but they had more representatives than people living in the cities. And this was just very unfair because the rural was more represented when the cities were more populated. And because of this dilemma, 2 political parties emerged. And we have the Tories and we have the Whigs. And the Tories were conservatives and the Whigs were liberals. The Tories were made of landed gentry, and the Whigs were made up of businessmen. And they were the emerging class. And the rotten boroughs allowed the Tories to control the parliament and enrich themselves. And how did they enrich themselves? Well, they were the ones that were holding the position in office, they were the ones that were voting, and they were the ones that were passing the laws. So for example, that's how the famous corn law got passed. And the corn law was a protective tariff on foreign wheat. And basically, they put a tariff on foreign wheat to protect the price of wheat in the country to benefit rich people with large farms. So the corn laws were made to enrich the landed gentry at the expense of everyone else. They made laws that would just make themselves more rich. And that was everyone was very unhappy. Well, not everyone, but so the very few landowners were happy. They were happy because they got to make themselves richer, they got to make laws, and because they represented very few people, they didn't have much arguing, discussion. Whenever they wanted to go, it's a lot easier to represent 10 people than to represent 100 or 200. So they were happy. But the Tories, the Whigs, which is our businessmen, they were not very happy. Keep in mind in 1832, only 1 out of 12 males could vote. So this means that wealthy factory owners could not even vote. And it's like, why not? We're very rich, we should vote, we're very up there. But because of the land requirement put in place, they weren't allowed to vote. If you live in the city and own a factory in the city, you're not going to be able to own enough land to reach the land requirement. So the first people to agitate, like, I want the right to vote, it was not the working class, but it was the wealthy businessmen. And the Tories, like I said, liked the broken system because it was easier for them. But it did not stand. And this is how we get the Reform Act of 1832. It's passed, and what it does, it basically forces the districts to actually represent the population. So there's going to be a redistricting to reflect the population shift to the city. And a few results of this would be that there's no more rotten boroughs. Another thing would be that suffrage for urban middle class would be allowed, well, limited. And how this happened was that they lowered the property requirements. So factory workers could now qualify, and you didn't have to be as rich. So before I said that 1 out of 12 males could vote, now 1 out of 6 males could vote. But keep in mind, that still meant that 5 out of 6 males could not vote. And the last thing is that even though there was suffrage for urban middle class, there's still no suffrage for the working class. And because there's going to be no suffrage for the working class yet, this will lead to the next movement, which is the Chartism movement. But that's it for the Reform Act of 1832. Thank you so much.